By morning, the story would be retold in fragments. People would argue about tone and timing, about who noticed first. But everyone would agree on one thing. There was a single sentence that changed the air in the room. A sentence that turned a safe place into a sealed one. The restaurant had been built for discretion. Muted gold light. Heavy curtains. Tables positioned to protect privacy without asking for it. Power came here to relax, which meant danger was always close but never visible. When the Korean Mafia boss arrived, conversation didn't stop. Softened. Laughter lowered itself. The room adjusted the way animals do when something larger enters the space. He didn't need an escort to announce him. His posture did that. Controlled. Untouchable. His mother arrived minutes later, guided with a care that bordered on reverence. She was smaller than most expected. Older. Her presence wasn't sharp like his. It was dense. People didn't look at her directly, not out of fear, but instinct. This was a woman who didn't need to raise her voice to end things. The waitress was already moving when they sat. She'd worked rooms like this before. Learned when to approach and when to disappear. Black uniform pressed clean. Hair pulled back tight. Her face held the practiced neutrality of someone who survived by being forgettable. She carried the tea service with steady hands, though her chest felt too tight for a full breath. When she reached the table, the boss didn't look up. To him she was function, motion, background. But the mother lifted her eyes, slow and deliberate, and that was when something shifted inside the waitress. Not courage. Not impulse. Memory. She spoke before she could stop herself. The greeting left her mouth soft and perfect, formed in a rare, old-world Korean dialect that hadn't been spoken casually in decades. It wasn't the kind of language taught to foreigners. It wasn't the polished version used in public life. This was intimate, regional, specific. The kind of greeting that carried history in its bones. This was the moment the room stopped being safe. Sound seemed to drain from the space. Chairs no longer creaked. Cutlery froze mid-air. A guard's hand hovered too close to his jacket and then stayed there. The boss finally looked up, his gaze cutting toward the waitress with sharp curiosity. He hadn't heard the words clearly at first, but he'd seen his mother's face. The waitress felt the weight of what she'd done settle over her like cold water. She kept her head bowed, eyes lowered, posture respectful to the point of submission. Every instinct screamed that she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She had spent years learning how to hide. And in a single breath, she had exposed herself. The mother stared at her. Not offended. Not confused. Studying. Her fingers tightened slightly on the table edge. She said nothing for a long second, and that silence was louder than any outburst. The boss watched his mother's expression change, watched recognition flicker across it, and felt something unfamiliar twist in his chest. Then she answered. She responded in the same dialect. Exact. Undiluted. As if continuing a conversation that had started long before this room existed. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Guards exchanged looks they didn't bother to hide. One of them shifted position without being told. The boss leaned back slowly, eyes never leaving the waitress now. His mother never indulged strangers. She barely acknowledged allies. And yet she had chosen to answer instead of correct. The waitress's knees threatened to give way. The response confirmed what she had feared the moment the words left her mouth. She had been recognized. Not as staff. Not as an outsider. Something else. Something that didn't belong here but was suddenly impossible to ignore. She straightened, forcing steadiness into her spine. Inside, panic pressed hard against her ribs. She had spoken the language because it had been safer once. Because silence had failed her before. But safety had rules. And she had just broken all of them. The boss studied her with a new intensity. He wasn't angry. That was worse. Anger could be managed. Curiosity meant time. He glanced at his mother, searching her face for explanation. She gave him none. Her eyes remained on the waitress, assessing, measuring, weighing a past that clearly wasn't supposed to be here. The power in the room shifted quietly. No one announced it. No one needed to. The waitress was no longer invisible. And invisibility had been the only thing keeping her alive. His mother tilted her head slightly, the gesture small but deliberate. The look she gave the waitress wasn't cruel. It was careful, like someone encountering a piece of their own history in the wrong place. The waitress understood then that this wasn't kindness. It was attention. And attention in this world was a form of capture. The boss finally opened his mouth to speak, but his mother raised a single finger, stopping him without looking away. The command was subtle. Absolute. He closed his mouth and waited. She spoke again, softly, in that same dialect. Not a question meant for politeness. A question meant to confirm something she already suspected. The waitress swallowed and answered, her voice steady only because she had no other choice. As the words left her mouth, she felt the last of her safety disappear. And as the mother listened, the boss realized the truth settling in front of him, heavy and unavoidable. This woman hadn't challenged him. She had stepped into a space no outsider should know existed. Why did his mother respond instead of correcting her? Welcome to Dark Crown Romance. Please like, share and subscribe. What she said mattered more than how she said it. The first people to move were not the loud ones. No chairs scraped back. No alarms sounded. The change happened quietly, like pressure shifting underwater. Conversations ended mid-sentence. Phones disappeared from hands. Guests who understood the rules began standing without being told, guided toward the exits with polite gestures that carried no room for refusal. Those who didn't understand followed anyway, reading the room and sensing that curiosity was suddenly dangerous. The waitress remained where she was. That alone marked her as different now. Anyone else would have been escorted away, dismissed, erased from the moment. Instead, the boss lifted one finger, subtle and precise. The guards paused. No one touched her. The doors closed. Not slammed. Sealed. The sound was soft, almost courteous, but it landed heavy. The kind of sound that meant decisions were being made somewhere above the level of explanation. The boss finally stood. When he moved, the space adjusted again. He didn't circle her. Didn't raise his voice. He simply faced her, close enough now that she could see the fine scar at his jawline and the stillness in his eyes. He wasn't angry. Anger rushed. This was slower, colder. She felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with skin. Every lie she'd practiced felt thin. Every version of herself she'd worn for survival began to peel away. She kept her gaze lowered, not submissive but respectful. The kind of respect that said she understood hierarchy, even if she didn't belong to it. Around them, guards repositioned with quiet efficiency. One moved closer to the mother. Two others angled themselves to block the hallway. Another took a place by the door, hand relaxed, ready. The room was empty now except for power. The boss spoke, and his voice was even, almost conversational. He asked her name. She gave the one on her papers. The safe one. The one that had worked everywhere else. He nodded once, as if confirming something he already knew was incomplete. His eyes flicked to his mother, who had resumed her seat as though nothing unusual had happened. She lifted her teacup, unhurried. Her calm was unsettling. This wasn't a disruption to her. It was an interruption she had chosen to acknowledge. The boss turned back to the waitress. He asked where she learned to speak like that. Not accusatory. Curious. As though discussing weather or wine. Her heartbeat thudded loud enough she wondered if he could hear it. She considered lying. The instinct rose fast. But something stopped her. Not fear. Calculation. Lies created trails. Silence created space. She said she learned it a long time ago. The room felt tighter. The boss smiled faintly. Not with his mouth. With his eyes. The kind of smile that came from finding a crack in something solid. He asked another question, this one simpler. Who taught her? She hesitated a fraction of a second too long. That hesitation landed harder than any confession. One of the guards glanced at her, just briefly, and she knew she had confirmed more than she intended. The boss didn't react outwardly, but something shifted behind his gaze. He wasn't mapping her answers anymore. He was mapping her history. He stepped back and gestured lightly. A guard leaned in and murmured something near his ear. The boss listened without expression, then nodded. The waitress noticed then that the exits were no longer visible from her position. The room had been reoriented around her without her moving an inch. That was when she understood the true danger. She wasn't being detained. She was being protected from variables. The boss addressed the room without raising his voice. He announced that the venue was closed for privacy. The word was chosen carefully. Polite, corporate, final. Privacy meant no witnesses. Privacy meant time. His mother finally spoke, her tone light, almost amused. She remarked that the girl's accent was old, regional, not something learned casually. She didn't ask a question. She made an observation. The boss inclined his head, acknowledging the statement. Then he looked back at the waitress, and his voice dropped just enough to signal that the conversation had narrowed. He said people who knew that dialect usually learned it in one of two ways. She felt her stomach drop. He didn't list the ways. He didn't need to. The implication was enough. Family. Or survival. The guards waited. The mother watched. The room held its breath. The waitress realized then that this wasn't an interrogation. It was an evaluation. And she was failing to disappear. He asked one final question softer than the rest. Not where did you learn it, but when did you stop using it? Her throat tightened, because that question assumed something terrifying, that she had used it often enough to stop. She didn't answer. The silence stretched, sharp and deliberate. The boss didn't rush it. He understood silence better than most men understood threats. Finally he nodded to himself, as if reaching a conclusion. Somewhere behind her, a door locked with a sound that carried too much weight for such a small motion. Where did she learn a dialect tied to a closed circle? This wasn't education. It was conditioning. She kept her hands folded because they shook when she didn't. The boss's silence pressed against her ribs, but the real weight came from memory, not the room. The smell of polished wood and tea blurred into something older, darker, a place where language wasn't beauty or culture but a leash. She had learned Korean the way people learn to flinch, through repetition and consequence. Not from books. Not from teachers who smiled. From voices that corrected her tone by tightening fingers around her wrist. From men who waited until she pronounced it perfectly before loosening their grip. She hadn't planned to speak it tonight. The dialect especially. That one lived buried beneath years of careful forgetting. It belonged to closed rooms and lowered eyes, to instructions given quietly so no one outside would hear. It was the language used when you were not supposed to ask questions. When understanding was mandatory. When mistakes were expensive. She realized she was being watched again. Not like before by strangers who scanned exits, but by people who knew exactly what they were seeing. The boss wasn't staring at her mouth. He was watching her posture. The way her shoulders stayed slightly rounded. The way she didn't look directly at authority unless invited. Those habits didn't come from service training. They came from survival. Her phone vibrated once against her thigh. The sensation sliced through her thoughts. No one else moved. No one else reacted. She didn't reach for it immediately. That too was learned. You never reacted fast. Fast reactions invited attention. She waited 3 beats, then another vibration came, sharper this time, insistent. The boss noticed the pause. His gaze dropped briefly, then returned to her face. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. Permission was implied in his stillness. She slipped the phone from her pocket and glanced down. The message was short. No greeting. No signature. Just a sentence that made her breath catch. You shouldn't have used that language. Her fingers went cold. The room seemed farther away suddenly, like she was watching it through thick glass. That message wasn't a threat. Threats were loud. This was confirmation. Someone had been waiting for her to reveal herself. Someone who understood exactly what that dialect meant. She deleted the message without replying. Muscle memory. Evidence was dangerous. Silence was safer. But the damage was already done. She had been seen. Marked. She looked up too quickly and caught it. A flicker of recognition that hit her before logic could stop it. One of the guards near the wall, tall, broad-shouldered, face unreadable, had shifted his weight in a way that sent a jolt through her chest. Not because he moved, but because she'd seen that movement before. Years ago. In a place where doors locked from the outside. Her breath stuttered. She looked away immediately, heart pounding. She told herself she was mistaken. Faces blurred over time. Trauma rewired memory. But her body disagreed. Her body remembered him before her mind wanted to. The way he stood at a slight angle. The way his right hand stayed closer to his jacket than his left. The scar near his ear, half hidden by hair. The boss followed her line of sight. Slowly. Deliberately. He didn't look at the guard. He looked at her reaction. And that was worse. He spoke softly, almost kindly, asking her to breathe. It was the wrong kindness. The kind used by people who understood fear intimately. She nodded, forcing air into her lungs. She realized then that he already knew the answer to questions he hadn't asked yet. She tried to anchor herself in the present. The warmth of the lights. The solid floor beneath her shoes. But memory kept intruding, sharp and uninvited. She remembered being corrected for tone. For speed. For looking up when spoken to. She remembered learning that certain words were not translated, only obeyed. That dialect was used when punishment didn't need to be explained. The boss asked her where she learned discipline like that. The word discipline landed heavy. Not education. Not fluency. Discipline. She swallowed and said she learned it because not learning it wasn't an option. The room reacted subtly. A shift in posture. A tightening of attention. The mother's teacup paused mid-air for just a second before she set it down. That tiny pause echoed louder than a shout. Her phone vibrated again. Another message. She didn't look this time. She didn't have to. She already knew what it would say. She was exposed. She was visible. And visibility was dangerous. The boss stepped closer, lowering his voice further, asking her one question that cut through everything else. He asked if she recognized anyone in the room. Her pulse thundered. She hesitated. The wrong answer could kill her. The right one could be worse. She said nothing, and in that silence, she felt the guard's presence like heat against her skin. Why did she recognize one of his guards? Approval would have been safer than recognition. The boss's mother didn't raise her voice when she spoke. She didn't need to. The room leaned toward her without realizing it, as if gravity itself had shifted. She asked the waitress to sit, not as a command, but as a courtesy that carried the weight of expectation. The chair was pulled out before the waitress could move, hands already guiding it into place. No one asked who allowed that. The mother's eyes studied her the way people examined antiques, not for beauty, but for origin. She asked her name again, this time pronouncing it carefully, testing the rhythm. Then she asked where she learned to bow that way. Not if she knew Korean. Not why she spoke it. How she bowed. The difference mattered. The waitress felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with language. She answered honestly because lies in rooms like this didn't sound like lies. She said she learned it because standing incorrectly had consequences. The mother nodded once, slow, deliberate. That nod was not approval. It was confirmation. She asked her to repeat the greeting. Not loudly. Not for the room. Just for her. The waitress hesitated, and in that pause, she felt the cost of obedience rise again in her throat. She spoke anyway. The dialect slid out like a scar reopening. Precise. Respectful in a way modern Korean wasn't. The mother closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, something hard had settled behind them. She said that dialect came from a time before forgiveness became fashionable. From a place where loyalty was taught through fear and betrayal was answered with silence. She said outsiders didn't learn it by accident. They learned it because someone wanted them to survive something they weren't supposed to talk about. The boss straightened. This was not information he'd expected. He watched his mother carefully now, not interrupting. The power in the room had shifted again, this time away from him. The mother asked one more question, softer than the rest. She asked who taught her. The waitress didn't answer immediately. Her chest tightened. Names were dangerous. Names had teeth. She shook her head instead and said the person who taught her didn't live long enough to be remembered safely. That answer landed heavy. The mother inhaled slowly, then reached for her tea again, hands steady. She said that place, the one tied to that dialect, was also tied to an old betrayal. One that had nearly collapsed their family from the inside. One that required outsiders to clean up what insiders had broken. The waitress felt her stomach drop. She hadn't known the full shape of the thing she'd survived. She'd only known the pain. The mother looked at her then, truly looked, and asked if she'd been paid to come here tonight. The waitress said no. Asked if she'd been sent. She said no. Asked if she'd known whose mother she was greeting. The waitress said no again, voice barely steady. Silence followed. Not empty silence. Evaluative silence. The kind that decided futures. The mother turned to her son and said the girl hadn't come hunting. She'd come hiding. That was worse, she added quietly, because it meant someone else had already found her. The boss's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the guard the waitress had recognized. The mother noticed. She raised a hand slightly, stopping him without a word. Authority inverted completely in that gesture. She said protection wasn't kindness. It was responsibility. And responsibility, once taken, could not be returned. She said the dialect the girl spoke marked her as unfinished business. Not an enemy. Not an asset. A debt. The waitress felt the weight of that word settle over her shoulders. Debt meant ownership. Obligation. The mother stood, slow and deliberate, and placed a hand briefly on the waitress's shoulder. The touch was light, almost maternal. Almost. She said the girl would stay. Not as staff. Not as a guest. She would stay because leaving now would finish what betrayal had started. The boss looked at his mother, then back at the waitress. His expression had changed. Not softened. Focused. The mother said quietly that she would not allow history to repeat itself through negligence. She said this one would not be discarded simply because survival made her inconvenient. Why did the mother decide to protect her? Safety doesn't feel safe when you didn't choose it. The word protection was never spoken out loud, but it wrapped around her the moment she stood from the chair. Hands didn't grab her, didn't rush her, didn't frighten her openly. That was worse. They guided her with quiet certainty, bodies forming a corridor that cut her off from the rest of the room. Conversations died behind her. Chairs scraped softly as people looked away, pretending this wasn't happening. The door opened before she reached it. Outside, the night air felt colder than it should have, sharp against her skin like a reminder that she no longer belonged to the room she was leaving or the world she was stepping into. The car waited with its engine already running, dark glass hiding whoever sat inside. She hesitated for half a second, instinct screaming that stepping into that vehicle would erase something she couldn't name. No one pushed her. No one threatened her. The door simply remained open, waiting. Choice, stripped down to its most dishonest form, she slid inside. The door closed with a sound that felt final. The lock clicked automatically. That sound stayed with her longer than the engine starting, longer than the car pulling away from the curb. The city moved past the tinted windows in streaks of light and shadow, familiar streets suddenly foreign when viewed through glass meant to keep the world out. She tried to speak. The words died before reaching her mouth. The man beside her, one of his, didn't look at her. He spoke into a wire she couldn't see, voice low, controlled, reporting movement like she was weather, not a person. The silence pressed in, thick and deliberate. She realized then that silence wasn't an absence here. It was a tool. The car turned twice, then 3 times, routes bending away from anything recognizable. She counted intersections out of habit, then stopped when she realized that habit was useless now. Whoever planned this didn't care if she remembered the way. That thought tightened something in her chest. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket. Not a message. Signal. She didn't reach for it. The last time she'd been followed like this, reaching for a phone had only confirmed how alone she was. When the car finally slowed, she expected a compound, a fortress, something obvious. Instead, it stopped beneath an unremarkable building that blended perfectly into its surroundings. No signs. No cameras she could see. That too was intentional. She was ushered inside through a private entrance, down a hallway that smelled faintly of disinfectant and money. The door behind her closed. Another lock. Another sound she wouldn't forget. In a room upstairs, the boss stood near a table covered in screens. Footage played silently. Angles she recognized. The restaurant entrance. The street outside. The moment she'd stepped through the door hours earlier, unaware. He didn't look at her right away. He watched the footage again, rewinding, slowing it down. Her stomach dropped when she saw it. A figure across the street. Another reflection in the glass. Someone adjusting position just before she entered. She felt exposed, seeing herself from above, from the side, unaware, unprotected. He pointed once. Small gesture. The screen froze. "You were followed," he said, not accusing, not questioning. Stating fact. She swallowed. She hadn't noticed. Or maybe she had, and survival had taught her to ignore it until it was too late. He changed the angle. Another camera. Another confirmation. The same figure appearing twice, 3 times, always distant, always careful. Not sloppy. Professional. The room felt smaller. Her presence in the restaurant hadn't been coincidence. Had been timing. He turned to her then. His expression wasn't angry. That frightened her more. "Someone wanted you seen," he said. "Specifically near me." The implications settled heavily between them. She hadn't just wandered into danger. She'd been placed inside it. The door behind her opened briefly. A man entered, spoke quietly to him, handed over a tablet. Financial records glowed on the screen. Transfers. Counts. Her breath caught when she recognized one detail. The name attached to the money trail. Not his. Connected to him, yes. Close enough to be trusted. Close enough to move without raising alarms. Her chest tightened. This wasn't an external threat pressing in. It was something rotten growing from the inside. He dismissed the man with a nod. The door closed again. He looked back at her, eyes sharper now. "This wasn't about killing me," he said. "It was about marking you." Her pulse hammered. Marking meant leverage. Exposure. Sacrifice. She realized then that being escorted hadn't been an act of mercy. It had been containment. Protection without asking wasn't protection at all. It was control justified by danger. She hugged her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how far she'd been moved from the life she understood. She had survived before by staying invisible. Tonight, invisibility had been taken from her deliberately. Someone had wanted her seen near him, wanted her existence to intersect with his power publicly, irreversibly. And whoever that someone was knew exactly what it would cost her. Who wanted her seen near him? Some memories survive because they're useful. She sat across from him with her hands folded tightly in her lap, fingers pressed together as if holding herself in place. The room was quiet in a way that made every breath feel audible. She had learned long ago that silence like this wasn't empty. It was waiting. He didn't rush her. That was another lesson she recognized too well. Men who rush want answers. Men who wait already know where the truth is hiding. She spoke before her courage dissolved. She told him the name on her documents wasn't hers. Not originally. Not completely. It was a name that fit easily enough. One that passed background checks and paid rent and didn't attract attention. A name chosen to survive, not to belong. She explained it without drama, without apology. Survival didn't require either. He watched her closely, not for the story itself, but for the shape of it. Pauses. The words she avoided. The way her shoulders tensed when she reached certain details. She told him she hadn't learned Korean because she wanted to. She learned it because someone demanded she understand without being spoken to twice. She learned it because misunderstanding meant punishment. She learned the dialect because that was the language used when orders weren't meant for outsiders. Old words. Sharp words. Words that carried authority and threat in equal measure. The kind of dialect that wasn't taught anymore because it was tied to places and events people pretended never happened. His expression changed at that. Not dramatically. Just enough. Recognition flickered behind his eyes. And she knew then that this wasn't just her past rising up. It was his. She told him about the place without naming it. A compound disguised as something harmless. Training disguised as work. Discipline disguised as culture. She described the way elders spoke, how respect was enforced through language as much as action. That dialect wasn't regional pride. It was control. It separated those who belonged from those who were disposable. She stopped when her throat tightened. The room felt heavier now, like something unseen had entered it. He finally spoke, voice low. That dialect was erased, he said. Not as an argument, as a fact. Burned out of circulation. She met his eyes. Not completely. That was the moment the past shifted from memory to consequence. He understood now why his mother hadn't corrected her. Why she'd responded instead. That dialect was a ghost both families had tried to bury. A language that tied them to an old betrayal. An internal purge that had reshaped alliances and rewritten history. He had helped erase it. Not directly. Not with his own hands. But by benefiting from what came after. She continued, quieter now. The people who taught her that dialect didn't want her fluent. They wanted her obedient. Language was the leash. She learned faster than they expected. Listened more than she was supposed to. That was why she survived when others didn't. That was why she ran when she finally had the chance. His jaw tightened. He could see it now. How her existence alone was evidence. Proof that something buried still breathed. Protecting her didn't just mean shielding a witness. It meant risking exposure of decisions that built his family's power. Decisions his mother had survived. Decisions the city pretended were ancient history. She watched him process it, every calculation crossing his face. He wasn't choosing between right and wrong. He was choosing between damage and disaster. Between letting her disappear and risking that someone else would drag her into the light more violently. Between protecting a woman who carried dangerous truth and preserving a legacy built on silence. You understand what this costs, he said finally. She nodded. She understood cost better than comfort. That's why I stayed quiet, she said. Until tonight. He studied her. And for the first time she saw uncertainty in him. Not fear. Protecting her meant reopening files that were never meant to be touched again. It meant drawing attention from people who would rather burn the city down than let old names resurface. It meant his family's past would no longer stay safely mythologized. She realized then that this was no longer about her safety alone. It was about what kind of man he chose to be when the past knocked without asking. Will he protect her, or his legacy? In this city, attention is a weapon. She didn't see it happen. That was the first mistake. The second was believing that silence meant safety. By the time the first meeting was cancelled without explanation, she was already circulating. Not loudly. Not publicly. Quietly. Screens that didn't leave fingerprints. Messages that vanished after being read. Her face, caught from an angle that made her unrecognizable to strangers but unmistakable to the right people. The city didn't react the way it did to explosions or arrests. Tightened. Schedules changed. Routes were altered. Names stopped appearing where they always had. People who never missed meetings suddenly couldn't be reached. Others left town overnight without saying goodbye. She felt it before she understood it. The air around her changed. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms she wasn't supposed to be in. Staff avoided eye contact. Security shifted positions with too much purpose. Even the silence sounded different, like something listening back. He noticed too, though he didn't say it immediately. He watched screens longer than necessary. Took calls in rooms she wasn't allowed to enter. When he did speak, his words were careful, measured, like stepping across thin ice. This wasn't panic. This was calculation. Someone had leaked her presence deliberately. Not as a threat. As currency. The city was being reminded that leverage still existed. That history could still be bought and sold. The whisper wasn't her name. It was her value. She overheard fragments without trying. Connected. Untethered. Survived. Each word landed heavier than the last. She understood then that she wasn't dangerous because of what she could say. She was dangerous because of who she forced others to remember. He didn't lie to her. He just delayed the truth until the city made it unavoidable. The bounty didn't appear as a public announcement. No posters. No numbers. Just a shift in behavior. Guards doubling. Unknown vehicles lingering too long. People asking questions that didn't sound like questions. When he finally told her, it was without ceremony. "They're not asking for me," he said. "They're asking for you." Her stomach dropped, but not from surprise. From confirmation. A price on her life didn't feel like hatred. Felt like strategy. Alive she was leverage. Dead she was closure. Both were useful. Neither was safe. She asked the question anyway. "Why me?" He didn't answer. Immediately. When he did, it wasn't comforting. "Because you don't belong to anyone yet." That was the rule change. She wasn't collateral damage anymore. She was the objective. He could negotiate for himself. He could disappear threats aimed at him. But a woman with no banner, no public protection, no declared loyalty. She was easy to trade. Easy to erase. Easy to justify losing. She watched him read the city's response in real time. Which factions moved first? Which stayed silent? Silence meant waiting. Waiting meant someone else would make the first move. The bounty didn't create danger. It organized it. The guards around her shifted again. Not closer. Later. She understood why. This wasn't about shielding her from a single attack. It was about controlling space. About preventing anyone from getting too close without being seen. Protection now came with visibility. And visibility came with consequence. She wondered what it cost him to keep her near. Every hour she remained under his roof, someone else adjusted their plans. Every day she lived, someone recalculated whether killing her would send the right message. This wasn't fear she was feeling. It was weight. The kind that pressed down slowly, reminding her that survival wasn't passive. She realized then that running wouldn't save her. Leaving his protection wouldn't make her invisible. It would make her easier. Alone, she would be proof of concept. A warning. With him, she was a question the city hadn't answered yet. The bounty changed the way people looked at her. Not with sympathy. With interest. She wasn't pitted. She was assessed. Alive, she could expose ghosts. Dead, she could bury them permanently. Both outcomes served someone. She asked him quietly, "If I disappear, does it stop?" He didn't hesitate. "No," he said. "It just ends faster." That was when she understood the final danger. Her value wasn't in what she knew. It was in the conflict she represented. The city didn't care if she lived or died. It cared what her fate would say about who still held power. Is she worth more alive or dead? Running would have been easier. He didn't present it like an offer. There was no warmth, no persuasion. No attempt to soften the edges. Just facts arranged in a line, clean and sharp. A new name already prepared. Documents that would pass scrutiny in countries that didn't ask questions. A route that avoided airports where faces lingered in databases. Silence permanent and complete. No contact. No return. No explanation owed to anyone. He said it the way men discuss logistics, not futures. He didn't look at her while he spoke. That told her more than the words did. This was mercy in his language. She listened without interrupting, hands folded, posture still. Every part of her understood the logic. Disappearing would cut the city's interest short. A vanished asset loses value. A ghost can't be traded. If she left now, the bounty would dissolve into rumor. The whispers would redirect. Attention would find something else to feed on. She would survive quietly, safely, alone. The silence stretched. He waited because he didn't need to rush her. Men like him didn't chase answers. They created conditions where answers revealed themselves. She imagined the new life the way someone imagines sleep while bleeding. A relief that feels close but not real. A place where no one knew the dialect she spoke in her head. Where no one watched her walk into rooms. Where her history stayed buried because no one knew where to dig. It was tempting. That frightened her more than the danger outside. Because disappearing wouldn't just erase the threat. It would erase her. Everything she'd endured would become unprovable. Everything she'd survived would belong to no one. Silence wouldn't heal her. It would just make the pain private. He finally looked at her then. Not expectant. Measuring. He knew the kind of choice this was. He'd made versions of it his whole life. She asked one question. If I go, she said, what happens to the people who put the price on me? He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice didn't change. They learn patience, he said. Or they learn nothing. That was the crack. The small space where her decision slipped through. Running would protect her body. Staying would protect the truth of what had been done to her. She understood suddenly that disappearing wasn't neutrality. It was permission. Permission for the city to continue exactly as it always had. She stood before he could tell her not to. The guards tensed, then froze when he lifted a hand. She moved closer, not away. Close enough that the cameras would catch it if they were already watching. Close enough that any observer would see alignment. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't challenge him. She simply said, I'm not leaving. The air changed. Not violently. Decisively. This wasn't defiance. It was acceptance of consequence. He studied her again, but this time there was something else underneath the calculation. Recognition. Not of courage. Of cost. You understand what staying means, he said. I understand what leaving means, she replied. That was the moment she crossed the line she hadn't known existed. Visibility wasn't protection. It was declaration. By standing beside him, she didn't just refuse safety. She claimed a position. In his world, proximity was language. Standing close said things she hadn't spoken yet. The false safety settled in immediately. The guards relaxed by a fraction. The movement outside slowed. For a breath it felt like equilibrium. Like choosing him had stabilized the danger, she felt it too. That dangerous calm. The kind that arrives just before consequences catch up, she asked quietly. What happens now? He answered without hesitation. Now they adjust. The city would read her choice the same way it read everything else. As signal. As challenge. As permission. She had turned herself from target into symbol. Symbols don't get hidden. They get tested. She realized the rule she'd broken wasn't about obedience or fear. It was about invisibility. She had refused to disappear. In doing so, she had announced herself to a city that punished those who demanded to be seen. Protection always sends a message. She learns that before she ever sees the blood. Starts with absence. Meetings that were scheduled simply don't happen. Calls that used to ring now go unanswered. A man who had been loud yesterday is silent today. Not because he's hiding, but because he's been removed from the conversation entirely. The city doesn't panic. It recalibrates. That's what frightens her most. Violence would have been easier to understand. Instead, everything becomes efficient, clean, purposeful. She is moved through spaces she was never meant to see. Not hidden but escorted. Doors open before she reaches them. People lower their eyes, not out of respect for her, but out of awareness of what standing near her now implies. She feels the weight of proximity in real time. His protection isn't a shield. It's a signal flare. It tells everyone watching exactly where power is concentrating. He never explains what he's doing. He doesn't need to. She sees the consequences unfold in quiet fragments. A news ticker that skips a name. Photo removed from a website without notice. A convoy passing through an intersection that had been blocked for years, suddenly cleared. Each action is restrained, almost polite. That restraint costs more than chaos ever could. She asks once late, when the city outside has settled into an uneasy stillness. Is this because of me? He doesn't lie. It's because you're visible. That's the collapse. The realization that standing beside him didn't just protect her from danger. It redirected danger through him. Every decision he makes now carries her shadow. Every enemy calculates her as part of the equation. Protection isn't free. It's paid for by someone else. She sees it when someone begs. Not dramatically, quietly. A man kneels and speaks in fragments, offering information she doesn't understand, promising loyalty he should have pledged years ago. The boss listens without expression. When it's over, the man is escorted away. Life. That's what unsettles her. Mercy here isn't kindness. It's leverage. She understands then that survival in this world isn't about innocence or guilt. It's about usefulness. And by choosing visibility, she has become useful in a way that cannot be undone. The alignment is made public without ceremony. Gathering. Controlled. Predictable. Cameras present but careful. She is brought forward, not introduced, not explained. She stands where family stands. Not equal. Adjacent. That's enough. The message ripples outward instantly. This isn't romance. It's declaration. Those who understand the structure see it clearly. She is under his name now. Not owned. Marked. The power lock snaps into place. Enemies hesitate. Allies adjust. The bounty shifts shape, not removed but complicated. Taking her now would mean crossing a line that has consequences far beyond a payout. Safety increases in one direction and disappears in another. She feels it immediately. The narrowing of choices. Freedom doesn't vanish all at once. Contracts. Routes close. Options thin. The future becomes smaller but sharper. She asks herself the question she's been avoiding. Is there any version of freedom left that doesn't involve blood on someone else's hands? He doesn't answer it for her. He wouldn't. Instead, he gives her truth without comfort. This is the last place you can stand and not be hunted, he says. Everywhere else you would be alone. Alone. The word lands heavier than any threat. She thinks of the life she almost chose. The silence. The erasure. She understands now that freedom was never about escape. It was about choosing which cost she could live with. She looks at the city through reinforced glass and realizes it's watching her back. Not with curiosity. With calculation. Protection has made her important. Importance has made her trapped. And yet, when she stands beside him again, when the room shifts to accommodate them both, she feels something steady beneath the fear. Not safety. Resolve. The knowledge that whatever comes next will come because she chose to be seen. The moral collapse isn't his alone. Shared. By standing close, she has accepted that survival here demands sacrifice. Not just from enemies. From everyone who stays. She doesn't know if freedom still exists. She only knows it no longer looks like running. Silence returned, but it felt heavier. By morning the city looked normal again. Streets reopened. Schedules resumed. Names reappeared where gaps had been. To anyone watching from the outside, nothing had happened. That was the first lesson she learned. Real power doesn't announce victory. It erases the need to talk about it. The threats were gone not because they were forgiven, but because they were finished so thoroughly that fear no longer needed a voice. She woke before sunrise in a room that wasn't hers, in a bed too precise to feel comforting. The air smelled faintly of smoke, not from fire, but from paper burned long after midnight. She didn't ask what had been destroyed. She already knew. He stood near the window, jacket folded over a chair, sleeves rolled as if the night had required work rather than violence. The city below him was calm in the way a body is calm after bleeding stops. She realized then that reset was the wrong word. This wasn't recovery. It was acceptance. The city had adjusted its memory to fit the new reality. She sat up slowly. Every movement felt deliberate, as if even her breathing needed to be careful now. She remembered the faces from the night before, the ones that had understood immediately what her position meant. Not admiration, calculation. She had become part of a structure, and structures don't love. They stabilize. He didn't turn when she spoke his name. He answered anyway. That unsettled her more than if he'd been watching. "It's over," he said, not gently, not proudly. Factually. Over meant there would be no follow-up. No loose ends allowed to dream of return. She asked the question she'd been carrying since the first door locked behind her. "Is there any way back?" He finally faced her then. Not with cruelty. With honesty that had no incentive to soften itself. He walked to the table and set something down between them. Folder. The edges brittle. Her name was not on it. That was the point. It was the last record of who she had been before survival taught her another language, another posture, another obedience. She reached for it instinctively. He didn't stop her. He never needed to. The moment her fingers brushed the cover, she understood what it represented. Proof that she could disappear without belonging to anyone. Proof that the dialect she spoke had once been learned by force, not choice. Proof that her past could exist separately from his world. He took a lighter from his pocket and placed it beside the folder. "This is the last door," he said. "If it exists, someone will try to open it." The room was quiet enough that she could hear the city breathing outside. Traffic starting. Life continuing. She thought of running again, not physically but backward. To a version of herself that believed survival meant staying unnoticed. She closed the folder herself. That was the moment that mattered. Not the fire. The decision. He lit the lighter. The flame was small, almost polite. When the paper caught, it burned quickly, hungrily, as if it had been waiting for permission. She watched every page disappear without flinching. Not because it didn't hurt. Because flinching would have been a lie. When it was over, he crushed the ash into a dish and carried it away. No ceremony. No apology. The final irreversible act completed without drama. She realized then that freedom hadn't been taken from her in the night. She had traded it, knowingly, for something heavier and harder to name. The city would never speak of this morning. It would remember only the calm that followed. But she would remember the truth buried beneath the silence. She had spoken a dialect she thought no one would recognize. By morning she understood the truth. In his world, language isn't communication. It's a claim.